This is Josh Bycer from GameWisdom.com. I hope you enjoyed this Critical Thought, your daily discussion on game design. Welcome to today's Critical Thought. As always, before we get going, thank you to everyone who is enjoying the great content here, and for you first-timers, be sure to like and subscribe. Before we get started with today's Critical Thought, I have a few brief announcements to make. First, YouTube is still having this kind of issue with hour-plus long videos and using their video editing software. I don't know if this is just a permanent change or just some kind of bug on their end, but until things get settled, for videos I upload that will be an hour or longer, these will probably be like our weekly Game Wisdom Lives or live developer interviews, they will have to go up without the usual intros and outros, I'm afraid, at least for right now. The other bit of news is that I've decided that because of the delays or with all the video content going up, that the recordings of my Game Wisdom Live show keep getting pushed further and further back from getting on here. So I've decided that for right now, whenever we do a live show, which will be usually Thursdays around 7:38 EST, that I will be posting the recording of that here on the YouTube channel just straight up on Friday. That way it's still relevant for the week, and we can easily move on to more great content over the weekend. And other than that, for those of you interested in my top picks for Game of the Year for 2016, I've started posting my top 10 lists on the Game Wisdom channel, or I'm sorry, on GameWisdom.com. So that will be going up for the next 9 weekdays up until December 30th, and I will be revealing my top games for that point. So in terms of actual regular posts, this will kind of be like almost like a 2-week vacation. But we still have plenty of topics here to talk about. So for today's Critical Thought, we're going to turn to an oldie but a goodie. JRPG versus, it's either now considered CRPG or now WRPG for Western. It's the classic East versus West design debate. And this has been something that's been going on now for pretty much since the 90s. The RPG genre is very similar to strategy or to turn-based strategy, and how there are different subgenres in it. You don't just play a turn-based strategy game, you can play a tactical strategy game, a 4X strategy game, a grand strategy, and so on. And when it comes to RPGs, the two major subcategories are going to, of course, be JRPG and WRPG. And it's kind of interesting how the two have kind of divided in terms of their design mechanics, and how things have been slowly changing over the years. When we talk about JRPG design, these are usually titles where the story essentially serves the mechanics, in the sense that the player really is not controlling or has any real impact on what's going on narrative-wise. There may be a few endings, good, bad, evil, like we see in Shin Megami Tensei, but it's pretty much there to service what we're going to be doing for the battles or for the majority of the time. Most JRPGs, as we've seen, have gone the turn-based route, although we have been slowly seeing more ARPG or even more combinations of MMOs with JRPG, such as with Final Fantasy 15, Final Fantasy 12, Xenoblade Chronicles, and probably a lot more. But JRPG games tend to allow for a little bit more in terms of digging into the mechanics compared to Western RPGs, at least in the bare sense of the word. You're usually going to be challenged to figure out the best ways to optimize your characters and min and max thereof. One of the more interesting aspects of JRPG design is that we have seen many different games go with some very wild combat systems. Everything from The World Ends With You, Resonance of Fate, Shin Megami Tensei, as we just mentioned, Xenoblade, and again, there are probably more out there that I am easily forgetting. Also, one of these days, I would love to show you guys Resonance of Fate. Probably one of the craziest JRPGs I've played since, well, The World Ends With You. Now, moving over to Western RPGs, these games, the mechanics actually tend to service the story, in that you're really going to be designing or playing a character that will allow you to influence the story or the overall world around you. Games like Skyrim, The Witcher, Mass Effect, Elder Scrolls, the whole shebang there. Even stuff like Dragon's Age, and a lot of the big name, I think we'll just call them WRPGs to make it easier on ourselves. But in these games, the mechanics or the gameplay tend to be kept more on the basic side. And instead, they tend to favor storytelling or player driven narratives or controls. In Skyrim, for instance, you are free to just build your character however you want. And even games like The Witcher and Mass Effect, even though they feature established characters, you're still allowed almost complete full reign of how these characters react and grow within the world. Now, of course, because of that, it does limit their mechanics to some extent. We've talked about this, I think, on a previous Critical Thought, and I know I've mentioned this on Perceptive Podcasts in the past. But when it comes to RPGs of this nature, I rather deal with mechanic-heavy games rather than story-heavy. It's kind of why I really have grown to love the Soulsborne series. And yes, there will be a Critical Thought both on Demon Souls and that one comparing Bloodborne to Dark Souls 3. They will both be coming up, I would say soon. It all depends on how this week's schedule looks. But what's very interesting about Soulsborne, and again, I don't want to go too much into it now because of those separate posts, but the Soulsborne series tend to really merge these two different schools of thought. When Demon Souls first started to achieve popularity, I remember reading people comparing to basically saying this is a Western RPG by Japanese developers, in a sense. And that is a very interesting way of looking at it. With a lot more modern JRPGs, we have been seeing them copy more of the like this kind of like world, being able to explore it more, rather than the very strict narratives that we've seen of JRPGs in the past. And we've been starting to see more Western RPGs, or even more Western developed games, seem to borrow more of the mechanics and that low level depth to them. For instance, Borderlands, which is considered a role-playing shooter, does feature a very interesting combat system in terms of its item generation, but still has a very set narrative that you would see in a JRPG. But when it comes to the two different schools of thought, at this point, it's definitely more about preference and what kind of audience you're looking to attract. As we said, when it comes to most Western RPGs or games developed in the West along these fronts, we've definitely seen fans gravitate towards the more open-ended and non-linear style. Again, Fallout, Skyrim, The Witcher, games along these lines that are essentially an open playground for you to explore, with a less emphasis on the moment-to-moment gameplay to some extent. They do feature unique systems, but it's not as mechanic heavy as we see in games like Xenoblade Chronicles, The World Ends With You, and even something like Soulsborne. When it comes to the JRPG side of things, these are games that are more about the moment to moment. Because of the fact that you're always going to be getting to battles, you're always going to be dealing with these enemies, they have to make the mechanics engaging and keep the player invested. And in some sense, the story, while it is still grandiose, as we have certainly seen with any of the Final Fantasy and SMT games, you're still not really given control over it. You're more or less the audience to the story compared to actively guiding it in Western RPGs. Now, here's a question for everyone watching. As I've said, the roles or the walls between JRPG and WRPGs have certainly been breaking down over, I think really at this point, the last maybe 6 or 7 years, maybe even a little bit more than that. As we talk about with Soulsborne, Xenoblade Chronicles, and even games like The Witcher that have a very extensive character progression and game mechanics. But for those of you watching, what do you think about this divide? Do you prefer WRPGs? Do you like JRPGs? Do you like even a mixture of the both? Let me know in the comments below. Like I said, for me, it's kind of interesting. There was a time where I just stopped playing JRPGs altogether. That was pretty much around Final Fantasy IX. And as I said, I didn't start to get back into them until Shin Megami Tensei Nocturne. But since then, we have been seeing again this kind of blurring between these two schools. Another really good example, and interestingly enough, another game that really brought me back into the RPG genre was the Etrian Odyssey series, which was essentially a Japanese take on Wizardry, which is a very famous CRPG back in the day. And speaking of CRPGs and WRPGs, we have seen almost a renaissance of them from the Kickstarter and indie front, with studios like Obsidian, who have been producing Pillars of Eternity. Oh my goodness, I can't believe I'm forgetting the name of the game. Wasteland, I think it's called. One of those, but we have been seeing more takes on bring back the older style games. And that's kind of where things are very interesting in terms of Western RPGs. In their original form, in terms of the CRPG genre, they were very much mechanic heavy, as they were pretty much built on the foundation of the D&D systems. Again, Might and Magic was a good example, Baldur's Gate, Icewind Dale, Neverwinter Nights, and even like a game like Knights of the Old Republic still had those elements of D&D in there, as BioWare was one of the major studios to really embrace those rule sets. And since then, as we've seen with this kind of blurring of genres, many Western RPGs have forego D&D rules in favor of their own streamlined take of it. And this is kind of why Pillars of Eternity and those games have been rising in popularity in the indie space as they return to those very heavy rules-oriented systems. Now, there is definitely another talk to be had regarding how RPGs have evolved. And again, that moving away from D&D and the quote-unquote dungeon master guiding things from the background is a major role of how RPGs have evolved. But we definitely don't have the time to talk about that today. But to wrap up today's critical thought, again, as a developer, these days it's not easy enough just to say your game's an RPG. And it's not even easy enough to say if your game's a Western RPG or a JRPG, as these genres and mechanics have certainly evolved. But when it comes down to like the simplest way is trying to figure out what your fan base is looking for. If you're going to develop a story that's built on, complete player interaction, complete control, then chances are you're going to focus more on the Western RPG style. If you're more about the battles, the combat systems, the mechanics, and the rules, typically that's going to be now more of a JRPG side. But again, these days you can really just mix and max them all you want, and as long as you're still dealing with RPG progression and abstraction, then you're still going to get RPG fans interested. And I almost forgot, very important example of still the old school CRPG design would be the studio Spireweb Software, who have been making games I think for now over 20 years in the style of the old school CRPGs. I put up a spotlight video of one of their later games a few months ago. But if you're looking for that old school CRPG style and you haven't heard of Spireweb, definitely check them out because they are pretty much designed around that kind of gameplay. Now, one last question that I want to bring up. For those of you watching this, again, we already asked about the Division, but what do you think about modern JRPGs? Like we've been seeing with Xenoblade Chronicles and the recent Final Fantasy games, which have forego the standard turn-based combat for more of this real-time and almost an MMO take on the design. I'm very interested about that because it kind of, in some sense, removes some of the barriers of JRPG design in the past, which would be the random encounters and just the complete upheaval of the pacing because of it. These days, with the real-time combat and seeing enemies on the field, it allows for a lot more active control, and it also makes the pace a lot more brisk compared to previous ones. Now, talking about that, I'm also interested, I haven't heard too much about, but I know there's probably going to be working on another Dragon Warrior game, which is the other major JRPG from Square Enix, which is the Enix side of that company. But I'm kind of wondering what they're going to be doing with that series because they did a little bit of evolutions with, I think, Dragon Quest 8, I want to say 8 or 9. And I'm wondering how they're going to keep things going and if they're going to try to change things like they've been doing with Final Fantasy. But again, this is one of those topics we can easily keep talking on and on about. And like I said, if you have any suggestions for topics or things to cover here on the Critical Thought, let me know in the comments below. But we are going to wrap things up here for today. Like I said, just to recap, for the hour plus videos here, again, like the major interviews and such, there won't unfortunately be having the intro and outro tags, at least for the foreseeable future. And again, stay tuned Fridays if you miss Game Wisdom Live, as that will be when the recordings will go up. I know today I did post last Thursday's one. That was just to get into the rotation, but we'll keep to that Friday schedule going forward. But again, thank you so much for watching. Be sure to check out my top 10 lists of games for 2016 on GameWisdom.com, where we examine the art and science of games. Once again, I am Josh Bycer. Have a great night, and I will see you all tomorrow with more great content here and on Game Wisdom. Take care. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and of course share with your friends. It always helps out. For daily posts on all manner of game design and industry topics, check out game-wisdom.com. To support the site and everything that I do, be sure to check out the Patreon campaign. If we can hit goals, it will mean more content for everyone to enjoy, and I'll be able to support myself and my household. If you want to follow me, you can find me on Twitter at GWBycer for updates throughout the day and random thoughts from me. And lastly, you can find me on Twitch right over there at GWBycer for daily streams most nights around 10 Eastern. Thanks again for watching the video, and be sure to check out more great content coming to the Game Wisdom channel real soon.